Picture this. You're a young soldier who's already seen 2 years of combat. You've marched through burned villages and bombed out cities. You've seen friends die beside you. You think you've witnessed everything war can throw at a human being. And then, on a spring afternoon in 1945, you smell something that makes hardened combat veterans drop to their knees and vomit. That smell came from 300 yards away. 300 yards from a place that would change everything these soldiers thought they knew about evil. This is the story of what happened when American forces stumbled upon the Nazi concentration camps. It's about the prisoners who'd given up hope. It's about soldiers who went to fight a war but ended up fighting for something much bigger. And it's about the moment when locked gates finally swung open for people who'd stopped believing in freedom. It was April 11th, 1945. The place was a concentration camp near a German town. A patrol from the 6th Armored Division was approaching the perimeter when the smell hit them. These weren't green recruits. These were combat veterans who'd fought across France and deep into Germany. They'd walked past corpses on battlefields. They'd seen bodies in every state you can imagine. But this was different. This was death on a scale they couldn't comprehend. Through the spring mist, they could make out figures pressed against a fence. At first, they weren't sure what they were looking at. The figures looked more like skeletons than people. They wore striped uniforms that hung off their bones like cloth on a hanger. Some were standing. Others had collapsed in the mud and could only watch from where they'd fallen. One soldier raised his binoculars. When he lowered them, his hands were shaking. "They're still alive," he whispered. But alive isn't quite the right word for what these people were. They were breathing, their hearts were beating, but something essential about being human had been stripped away from them. Here's what makes this moment so powerful. For over 21,000 prisoners behind that wire, liberation wasn't something they expected. It wasn't even something they dared to hope for anymore. They'd stopped believing in rescue. They'd stopped believing in anything except making it through one more day and maybe finding peace in death. And then, soldiers with strange accents appeared. They broke the locks. They said words these prisoners thought they'd never hear again. "You're free." But freedom? After what they'd been through, freedom was harder to believe in than death. Let's step back for a moment. The Nazi concentration camp system had been running since 1933. That's 12 years of perfecting a machine designed to break human beings. By April 1945, as American forces were pushing deeper into Germany, there were approximately 700,000 prisoners still alive in camps scattered across what used to be Nazi territory. The numbers are hard to wrap your head around. More than 1,000 main camps and subcamps. At the system's peak in 1944, around 715,000 prisoners. American forces would eventually liberate about 250,000 people. But here's the truly horrifying part. When Americans arrived at one of the major camps, they estimated between 20,000 and 30,000 prisoners were already dead, just lying there. The prisoners who were still alive? Adult men who should have weighed somewhere around 150 to 180 pounds were down to 75 or 85 pounds. Think about that for a second. That's the weight of a 12-year-old child. In those final months, prisoners were getting maybe 700 to 900 calories a day. For context, a single fast food burger has more calories than what these people got in an entire day. Disease was killing approximately 3,500 people per day across the major camps. American military intelligence had received reports about these camps. Documents mentioned detention facilities, forced labor, prisoner deaths. But intelligence reports are just words on paper. They can't capture the reality of what was actually happening. They can't communicate what it means when humanity itself becomes the target. The camps existed in this weird bubble of willful ignorance. German civilians in nearby towns all claimed they didn't know, even though smoke from the crematoriums was visible for miles, even though thousands of prisoners marched through their streets, even though that smell carried on the wind. Everyone knew, but nobody admitted it. As American forces pushed through Bavaria and other regions in early April 1945, forward units started encountering evidence of something beyond normal military operations. Refugees whispered about camps where people went in but never came out. Reconnaissance planes photographed compounds with weird layouts, long barracks, guard towers, facilities whose purpose wasn't clear from the air. On April 4th, the 4th Armored Division approached a small camp. It was actually a sub-camp of a larger complex. Most prisoners had been evacuated days earlier, but what remained shocked soldiers who thought they'd become hardened to war. The company captain documented what they found. Approximately 3,200 corpses in various states of decomposition. Clear evidence of systematic murder. Bodies showed signs of execution, starvation, and beating. Living prisoners numbered fewer than 200, and all of them were in critical condition. Several died during the first hours after Americans arrived, even though medics immediately started trying to help them. The captain's report recommended urgent headquarters notification. He wrote that what they found exceeded standard war crimes parameters. That's military speak for, "This is something we've never seen before, and we don't have words for it." The discoveries triggered immediate attention from the top. The Supreme Allied Commander himself visited the camp on April 12th, bringing 2 other high-ranking generals with him. He ordered comprehensive documentation. He mandated that nearby German civilians be brought to witness what had existed practically in their backyard. One of these generals was known as one of the toughest combat veterans in the entire army. He vomited behind a barracks. Another general just stared in silence. The Supreme Commander walked through the entire camp methodically, refusing to turn away from any horror. Then he issued orders that would echo through history. Get it all on record. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will deny this happened. 7 days after that first small camp, American forces approached one of the largest and oldest camps in the Nazi system. Intelligence estimated maybe 10,000 prisoners. The actual number? Over 21,000 people packed into facilities designed for a fraction of that. Here's where the story gets interesting. Prisoners inside this camp had organized a secret resistance network. They'd maintained clandestine communications. They'd hidden weapons salvaged from forced labor in nearby weapons factories. When guards started to flee on April 11th, these resistance members seized control of watchtowers and prevented the final massacre that standing orders had mandated. So when American tanks reached the perimeter that afternoon, they found prisoners controlling the camp. But they couldn't escape. The electrified fences still carried current, the gates were still locked, and these people were too weak to break free, even with the guards gone. An intelligence officer who spoke German approached the main gate cautiously. He wasn't sure whether armed prisoners represented a threat or victims. Through the wire, thousands of faces stared at American uniforms with expressions he struggled to understand. Not joy, not relief. Something closer to disbelief. He called out in German that they were American Army, that they were safe, that they were opening the camp. Complete silence. No reaction whatsoever. Years later, this officer recalled, "I think they thought they were hallucinating, that starvation had finally broken their minds. When tanks broke the locks and gates swung open, people just stood there. They'd stopped believing in open gates." The experience of liberating camps created psychological burdens that persisted throughout these soldiers' lives. Combat veterans who'd fought across Europe described camp liberations as more disturbing than anything they'd experienced in battle. The liberators struggled with rage, helplessness, and moral reckoning. Rage at perpetrators of systematic atrocity. Helplessness at being unable to save everyone despite their best efforts. Moral reckoning about humanity's capacity for organized evil and what civilization meant if such systems could exist. One soldier who'd fought from the beaches of Normandy all the way to this camp wrote to his parents in late April 1945, "I thought I understood what we were fighting against. I was wrong. I understood military enemy, strategic objectives, tactical situations. I didn't understand evil until I walked through that camp." He continued, "Now I know exactly why this war mattered and why we could never have accepted anything except unconditional surrender. Some things can't be negotiated with." But the liberators also discovered unexpected reserves of compassion within themselves. Soldiers hardened by combat found themselves crying over prisoners they couldn't save, sharing personal supplies with strangers, staying up through nights sitting with dying men who just needed someone present in their final hours. One staff sergeant described his transformation. "Before this camp, I was a soldier following orders and trying to survive. After this camp, I understood I was part of something bigger, that we were fighting for basic human dignity against systems designed to destroy it. Every prisoner we saved justified the entire war," he said. "Everyone we lost drove me to ensure this could never happen again." The immediate liberation was only the beginning of recovery processes that would take months or years for survivors whose bodies and minds bore wounds that medical treatment alone couldn't heal. Physical rehabilitation from starvation and disease proved challenging but achievable. The psychological recovery from systematic dehumanization took lifetimes. Displaced persons camps established by Allied authorities became temporary homes for tens of thousands of survivors who had no families or homes to return to. Many survivors faced grim reality. Their communities had been destroyed, their families murdered, their home nations often still hostile to their presence. American personnel staffing these camps continued the humanitarian work that began with liberation. They provided not just food and shelter, but also assistance with family searches, immigration paperwork, vocational training, and psychological support. The commitment extended beyond military necessity into moral obligation. The survivors themselves exhibited extraordinary resilience. People who'd endured years of systematic destruction found strength to rebuild lives from nothing. They learned new languages, acquired new skills, built new families, created futures that concentration camps had tried to make impossible. The liberation of concentration camps forced American forces and American society to confront uncomfortable questions about knowledge, action, and moral responsibility. When had Allied intelligence known about camps? Could liberation have come sooner? Had military priorities delayed rescue of people dying while battles over strategic objectives continued? The questions had no satisfying answers. Allied intelligence had received reports about camps throughout the war, but had struggled to verify information or understand the systematic nature of what was happening. Military strategy had prioritized defeating armed forces rather than rushing to specific locations. The decision-making that balanced military objectives against humanitarian rescue remained morally complex decades later. What remained clear was that when American forces reached camps, they responded with immediate and comprehensive humanitarian action despite having no advanced preparation, inadequate resources, and ongoing combat operations requiring their primary attention. The response wasn't perfect, but it was wholehearted. The Supreme Commander's insistence on documentation and witness reflected understanding that liberation created moral obligation beyond immediate rescue. The world needed to see what had existed, needed undeniable evidence that would prevent future denial or minimization of crimes. The photographs, films, and testimonies collected during liberation became foundational evidence at war crimes trials. They educated generations about Holocaust realities and served as warning about where ideology unchecked by moral restraint could lead. On April 11, 1995, 50 years after one of the major camps was liberated, elderly survivors gathered with elderly American veterans at the camp, now preserved as a memorial. Among them stood a 71-year-old former prisoner beside a 72-year-old former medic. The prisoner who'd thought American gentleness meant his mind had broken. The medic who'd made impossible triage decisions in liberation's first hours.
"He saved my life," the former prisoner said simply, his hand on the former medic's shoulder. "Not just physically. He and the others saved our humanity. We'd been treated as less than animals for so long that we'd started believing it. When Americans arrived and treated us as people worth saving, they gave us back ourselves." The former medic, his voice rough with emotion, responded, "We just did what had to be done. We couldn't save everyone, and that knowledge still haunts me. But every person who survived," he continued, "everyone who got to live a full life after that hell, that's why we fought the war. Not for territory or strategy, but so places like this could never exist again." The liberation of Nazi concentration camps by American forces was never about glory or heroism in conventional military terms. It was about confronting the darkest capabilities of human civilization and responding with the best capabilities of human compassion. It was soldiers who'd been trained for war discovering their greatest mission was mercy. The prisoners who walked through open gates couldn't believe American soldiers had come for them, because they'd stopped believing anyone cared whether they lived or died. Their shock at liberation testified to how completely Nazi systems had tried to erase their humanity and their hope. But when American forces arrived, broke the locks, provided food and medicine, and treated skeletal strangers with dignity and care, they proved that mercy could transcend hatred, that hatred could be restored, even in places designed to destroy it, and that the ultimate victory wasn't just defeating evil armies, but refusing to become evil in response to evil. Think about that the next time you hear about good versus evil, about right versus wrong, about whether individual actions matter in the face of overwhelming darkness. Those American soldiers who broke open the gates and wept over people they'd never met, they proved something essential about what we can choose to be, even when confronted with the absolute worst of what humans can do to each other. The prisoners who survived and rebuilt lives from nothing, they proved that hope isn't naive, that resilience isn't just a word, and that the human spirit can endure things that should break it completely. And all of us, hearing this story decades later, we're challenged to ask ourselves, what would we have done? Would we have been the ones who claimed not to know? The ones who followed orders? Or the ones who, when confronted with unimaginable suffering, responded with unimaginable compassion? That's the real legacy of liberation. Not just that it happened, but what it tells us about who we can choose to be.